to me, that's part of what neurotheology is about, which is being a little bit more open and understanding and compassionate about other points of view, which I think are very important for us to take into consideration.
Okay, Dr. Newberg, welcome to the show.
Thank
Now,
you. Thanks for having me back.
in uh, in preparing for this conversation, I discovered your course with the Great Courses, and one of the things that I found really interesting about that was you mentioned a study that was done, I think it was in the early 90s in Washington, where they brought together, I think it was 4,000 meditators into the city, and then they measured the effect on crime rate, right? So
Right.
I wanted to ask you about, the key findings from the study and what you make of them, given your background as a researcher in this area.
Well, these are very interesting studies that are looking at the effects of, I mean, ultimately, they're looking at the effects of human consciousness on the world. And we typically, at least on a very kind of Western scientific perspective, think of ourselves as being inside of our head, and our brain is what's in there, and our consciousness is kind of connected to the brain and produced by the brain. There are certainly a lot of individuals and scholars out there who have a different perspective, and it even derives in certain traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism, the idea that there's kind of a more universal consciousness which is out there that our brain then kind of connects with in some way. And so it coalesces within us while we're alive. And arguably speaking, then, consciousness can be what they refer to as non-local, meaning that I could somehow affect you in some way, or I can affect, the world in some way. And there have been lots and lots of studies that have looked at these kinds of relationships. And you mentioned, some very interesting studies where they did this in a couple of cities where they would bring a fairly large group of people, a couple thousand people, into a city who were all going to meditate. Typically, they're meditating on very positive thoughts of compassion and so forth. And then what they do is a kind of an ad hoc analysis. They look at well, what happened to crime rates if you look, the couple of months before, the month, right after that, or the week after that, and then, what happens down the road. And there have been several studies which have shown that that when they do this, that the crime rates seem to drop, which is very intriguing. Obviously, it's very challenging to know exactly what that means. It's happened in more than one study, and so as researchers, we certainly should be taking these kinds of studies seriously, but with appropriate caution, as we should do with every research study. But they are fascinating, and they're analogous to some of the studies on intercessory prayer, where people are praying for each other, praying for other people. And there have been some studies that have shown that if you're, it was a study on cardiovascular patients, and it showed that that the people who were prayed for, who didn't know they were being prayed for, wound up getting out of the hospital about a half a day, earlier than the people who were not prayed for. So the first big question, of course, is, do we ultimately believe these studies? And again, I think they certainly have to be taken seriously. There's certainly a fair number of these studies which have shown an effect. It's pretty hard to explain it away completely, although certainly there are critics who try to. And it raises a lot of fascinating questions. I mean, if we are to give credence to these findings, what do they mean? And can we turn to these approaches to try to help make the world a better place? Of course, it raises intriguing methodological questions of, well, what if you send one person, and why? How many people do you need? And do they have to be in the city? Could you have people in Los Angeles meditating for people in New York or something like that? So how many people? How close do you have to be? And of course, there's the flip side too, which is What about people who are hoping for the negative? I always sort of think we talk about this jokingly, at some type of sporting event, a football game or something like that, where, half the people are rooting for one team and half the people are, and praying for them, and half the people are praying for the other team. So, does one team win or lose because of the prayer? The one side was more fervently praying than the other. But one of the other things that I have noticed in many of these studies, and again, this is kind of a larger picture question, is that even if we acknowledge that these effects happen, they do seem to be relatively small. And so, if, for example, when they look at people trying to affect like a random number generator, you like, if it's supposed to, if 50% is the normal effect that you should see, then it's 51 to 49%. It's a very tiny effect. So, again, then the question is, how ultimately relevant is it in terms of the overall effects that we see? Obviously, it's fascinating, and it could be very paradigm shifting in terms of how we understand the mind and consciousness. But there is also always that sort of, pragmatic perspective. And we talk about this in the medical world all the time too, which is that, if I find that meditation reduces your blood pressure by 3 points, that's not all that relevant if your blood pressure is 60 points too high. But so there's the statistically significant, and then there's the clinically or practically relevant, and both are important questions for us to address. But it's certainly fascinating. It's something for us to think about, and ultimately, even if it is a tiny effect, any effect at all is really kind of paradigm shifting, and there are a lot of people who are trying to explore this and trying to understand it, and ultimately there's sort of the question about mechanism, which is, if consciousness can do this, what exactly is it doing? Is it energy? Is it reaching, connecting through some universal consciousness, whatever that means? So there's a lot of intriguing questions that come up about it. But thank you for asking the question, because these are very interesting studies that, to me, are also part of the world of neurotheology, which is, how do we think about the mind and the brain and our spiritual selves and consciousness? All these concepts kind of swirl around in terms of us trying to figure these things out.
Well, I have to ask, because you've spent decades in this field, and studying the relation between science, spirituality, and religion, and how spirituality and religion affect the brain and everything. What are your own views on what consciousness actually is? What's your take on that small question?
Yeah, I can answer that in 10 seconds. Now, I mean, most simplistically speaking, I guess we typically talk about consciousness as awareness, although that's really just substituting another word. And so, whether or not consciousness itself is a external thing, or is something that emerges from the complex processes of the human brain, I don't know. This to me is part of the reason why I do the work in neurotheology, because I think it is, trying to understand consciousness is truly intriguing. No one has a clear answer for it. One of the questions that I always challenge my students with, especially when they're very materialistically oriented, I'll say, well, in the brain you have you have your neurons, you have depolarizations of the cell membrane, you have sodium and potassium rushing across that cell membrane, you have metabolic activity, you have neurotransmitters being released across synapses, you have electrical changes going on, and and blood flow and all this stuff happening. So where in all of that are your thoughts? Where in all of that is your consciousness? And of course, there is no clear answer to that question. If we say, well, the consciousness is within the neurons, well, does that mean that one neuron has consciousness, 20 neurons have consciousness, a billion neurons has consciousness? So we don't really know. And in some of my early work, where I was really trying to look at this in a little bit more detail, on kind of at least on a very basic level, we have two ways of kind of thinking about what the universe itself is made of. So one of them is that it's made of matter and energy, and so it's sort of the matter material perspective of things. And of course, that's very helpful in terms of, where do stars and planets come from, and where do the amino acids and DNA come from, and so forth. But as I was just talking about, how do you go from stuff which does not have consciousness to stuff that does have consciousness? Now, of course, we have a similar kind of question when we talk about, atoms themselves, we don't typically consider to be life. But if you put enough of them together in a certain way with membranes and organelles and different pumps and pores and all the different enzymes and so forth, eventually something becomes living. And then you've got bacterial living versus complex organism living. And how does that all happen? There's really some challenging questions from that perspective. The flip side is that we say, well, the universe really derives from consciousness. Consciousness is really the primary stuff of the universe. Certainly consistent with many of the religious and spiritual traditions, even monotheistic traditions. Basically, if you are a subscriber to the Bible, God creates the universe really from God's consciousness. And certainly, if you come from more Buddhist or Hindu perspective, there's the idea that there is a universal consciousness that basically is the foundation of the universe. Now, the nice thing about starting with that is that we get the idea. It makes it easy to explain where consciousness comes from, because the universe is conscious. So that's easy. But now you have the flip side problem, which is, so where does matter come from? What exactly does matter look like? And how is that manifested out of consciousness? Does consciousness create matter as something separate? Is it some other version of matter? In and of itself, it becomes very complicated to, with either starting point, to be able to answer kind of what the universe is about. And my best guess as an answer to your question, I guess, is that I ultimately think that matter and consciousness are kind of, two sides of the same coin, so to speak, two ways of looking at the same thing. The analogy is the idea of looking at light as both particle and wave kind of thing. And I'm not saying that you should use quantum mechanics as part of the explanation, although that's another perspective that people often take. But the idea that, if you kind of look for matter, you find matter, and if you look for consciousness, you find consciousness. And I think there's some degree of truth behind that. But to me, this is part of the larger picture of what neurotheology itself is all about, which is trying to understand the nature of the mind and brain in relation to spirituality, religion, consciousness. Where all of these different pieces fit in is extremely challenging. And a lot of times, and maybe the last way I'll answer your question is that for me to answer the question, I may ultimately need to throw it back to you and say, well, how are you defining consciousness? And then I can kind of tell you, whether or not that's what consciousness is. And we run into that problem as well, because if we are to define consciousness as something that derives from the material brain, then we think about it one way. If we say consciousness is a universal awareness, then we define it another way. And we see these kinds of definitional issues coming up in neurotheology all the time. What is the soul? What is the mind? What is the spirit? And so forth. We can define those on theological grounds, philosophical grounds, scientific grounds. And each person and each perspective will have a different take on it, which makes it challenging and fun and exciting. But these are the larger questions that we have to think about. But it'll be studies like the one that you first mentioned. Studies of near-death experiences are another really interesting area of potential research, because people have the experience of getting outside of their body. And if that's the case, then that would imply that consciousness can get outside of the body. That's what's felt in near-death experiences. And there are some very formal approaches which are being taken right now in certain studies to try and nail that down and see if we can really, demonstrate that. So we'll see. But obviously, it'd be very exciting if we could ultimately show that consciousness, is something that extends beyond just the material realm. But at the moment, we don't know that for sure.
So you mentioned near-death experiences there, and there are a lot of people report on these experiences, and a lot of them report back having similar kind of things happen,
Correct.
which is interesting. Can
Fascinating.
you can you tell us about maybe some of the common things that people report back, and also why do you think these experiences are so transformational for people? Because often people have one and then they'll completely change their lives afterwards. So what do you think might be happening there?
Well, the easier question is what seems to happen. People over the last maybe 20 or 30 years who have analyzed the reports of so many people with near-death experiences do talk about certain core elements of these experiences, and it actually sort of many of them start with the knowledge of the death. That this is some type of terminal event for a person. Another very, and not all of these elements happen for everyone, but there's a lot of similarity, a lot of commonality. So a lot of times people then have an experience of kind of going through a tunnel, if you will. They feel that they're kind of proceeding through a tunnel. And towards the end of that tunnel, sometimes they have the experience of interacting with other beings. Sometimes those other beings are deceased individuals. Sometimes that they know. People will say, I saw my grandfather, or I saw my uncle, or something like that, who died 10 years ago. Sometimes it can be a religious figure. So sometimes they feel that they come in contact with Jesus or Buddha or something like that. And then ultimately, they have this experience of entering into this realm of light, which is usually the most beautiful imagery and experiences that they ever have. At some point, there's kind of a threshold where if they go beyond that, then they're sort of there. And some decision is sort of made, so to speak, where they either stay where, in the afterlife experience, or they come back. And sometimes it is a conscious decision. People will say, I felt like, I had to come back from my family or something like that. I wasn't ready to do this yet. Other times it feels like it's sort of decided for them. But either way, then they come back. And but again, and then a couple of other common elements that are reported are this feeling of kind of floating outside of the body, often getting up into like the corner of the room, and being able to look down and seeing the doctors and nurses working on them, or whatever's going on. Sometimes they can describe, this nurse had red hair, or the doctor had a beard, or whatever. And so they can have certain descriptions of the people in the room. Sometimes people talk about going into other rooms, and they'll feel that they can see the patient who is in the room next door, or something like that. And so, again, from a perspective of consciousness, these are fascinating, because there seems to be these elements of kind of getting outside of the brain, of the mind, being able to persist, or consciousness being able to persist after the death of the brain. Now, there are some really interesting issues with that, because we don't fully know if the brain is truly dead. And so, and I mean, obviously, to some degree, it isn't, because they do come back. And of course, we have never heard from somebody who doesn't come back, so we don't know what happens beyond that. But you could try to associate some of these experiences with natural brain processes. The tunnel experience, one of the things that I've proposed at times, is that we have a visual cortex, and the center of the visual cortex is the center of our vision. So we lose our periphery first, as we lose blood flow. It's the core areas that get most of the blood flow. So if you die and now you stop blood flow to the brain, the core areas are going to survive last. And which means that you're going to get sort of progressively into the feeling of a kind of tunnel. You're going to lose your peripheral vision and just focus on the core. So, you can try to explain that. We've all had dream experiences where we see deceased relatives and things like that. So, could this represent the evoking of some memory of a grandfather, or something along those lines, in much the way we might see somebody who's died in a dream, possibly. And of course, so there are some ways of explaining at least some of the elements. Now, again, if we can truly verify, and there are people who've been trying to do that in a really formal way, that when they float up to the top of the ceiling, they can see what's going on. If we can really verify that this has happened, then it really does imply that the person's mental processes, consciousness, whatever you want to call it, has actually been able to leave the body. And again, it may depend a little bit on what is happening. One could potentially be, in a near-death state, but our ears are open, so maybe we can hear what people are saying and kind of infer what they do or what they're looking like. But again, if you could truly identify, one of the studies that has been looking at this, and as far as I know, I don't think they've had any, true hits yet, so to speak, is where they go to like trauma bays and emergency rooms where they know that people are more likely to have a near-death experience. And above where the person's bed would be, they would put like a shelf. And on the flip side of that, they would have some kind of photograph or image or something like that. I'm making up one now, but let's say like a picture of the Eiffel Tower or something like that. So now if a person reports that they had a near-death experience in that room, you could say, well, did you see anything? And if they say, yeah, it was weird, I saw a picture of the Eiffel Tower, okay, now that, because there would be no way for them to know that that was there. And so I know some investigators are kind of working on that. But anyway, so all of that kind of, helps us to try to figure out what's going on from a brain perspective, as well as from the perspective of what these experiences actually represent. You mentioned the transformative element, and in our most recent book, we talk about the varieties of spiritual experiences, and near-death experiences certainly fall into that category. And we don't fully know the neurophysiology of how these experiences transform people, but that does also seem to be a pretty universal characteristic of all of these different very, very intense spiritual, mystical, near-death types of experiences, where it really transforms them. And when we ask people about that, it changes the way they think about their job, about their lives, about their relationships. They don't fear death anymore. But what we don't fully know is exactly how that happens, because it's not typically how we think of the brain working. Normally we learn things over long periods of time. When you learn mathematics, you start learning addition and subtraction and division, and then you kind of work yourself up to algebra and calculus. It's not like you just walk into class and suddenly you know how to do quantum mechanics or something like that. But here it does seem to be almost that kind of experience where in moments, literally seconds or minutes, it really changes the complete way a person thinks about the world, and whether or not it literally rewires the brain. Maybe there are connections that were sort of there, but now they become kind of reconnected in ways that weren't there before, or whether these connections were always there, and much like a video game where you unlock a new player type of thing, maybe these experiences do that in some way. But the problem is, of course, that we never really know when these experiences are going to happen. So we never have the pre-condition of the person. We always get the post-condition when they had the experience. And so we don't know, while they tell us that they have been transformed, we don't know exactly what that means in terms of, being able to truly evaluate them before and after. So scientifically, methodologically, it is very difficult to do that.
It's wild speculation. I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, but we've all got these kind of mental models and maps that help us to kind of navigate the complexity of reality. And it seems that experiences like this, or even a psychedelic experience, it's almost like a disc cleaner for those maps and models that allow people to maybe form new connections and new maps following the experience, just because it's such a shock to the system. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, part of what that I've hypothesized in some of this, and myself and my colleagues, one of the neurophysiological changes that we see when we talk about different parts of the brain, and we talk about very complex networks of the brain that are involved in just how we work in general, and become involved in these kinds of experiences. And what we've noticed with a lot of spiritual experiences, very intense ones, is that they tend to be associated with a decrease of activity in the frontal lobes behind the forehead. And this is kind of interesting. So, normally the frontal lobes turn on when we are concentrating, when we are doing something purposeful. If I'm trying to solve a math problem or something like that, then my frontal lobe turns on to try to do that. And in fact, even when people are doing spiritual practices like meditation or prayer, we typically see an increase of activity in the frontal lobes. But when people have these very profound spiritual experiences, part of what they experience is a kind of a feeling of surrender, a feeling of letting go. And we have some evidence to suggest that when they feel that, that the frontal lobe activity actually drops, drops even below kind of the normal level that they are. So that's part of what helps us to feel, helps the person to feel that they're not making it happen, that they're kind of along for the ride, so to speak. But it may have an ancillary effect, which is very much like what you just described. The way I describe this more simplistically is that, part of what the frontal lobes also do are what are called our executive functions. So they kind of keep our lives organized, and they help us, keep our checkbook here, and keep our, what we need to do for our home here, and what we need to do for our work here, and what we need to do for our family here. And, to sort of use an analogy, I mean, it's sort of like, a big file cabinet, and the frontal lobes kind of keep everything in their files. And so when it's time to deal with the house, we take out our house file and we say, okay, I got to call the roofing person to fix the roof. And then we put that back, and then, I gotta, I gotta go to the supermarket. What do I need at the supermarket? I take my supermarket folder out. When the frontal lobe drops, it's sort of like you've kind of thrown all the files up in the air, because they're no longer under any control. And now, as you start to kind of come back from that experience, you're now trying to like put all the files back in as quickly as you can. And obviously it doesn't organize it quite the same way as it did before. And I think in that regard, in that kind of an analogy, that's kind of what we see happening, that you sort of, like you said, you kind of scramble things up a little bit, and then, put back in a kind of a novel way of thinking about it, which also includes the content of the experience, which is very important. So previously we did have, house, children, dogs, market, job, and all that, and it was all very separated. One of the other typical elements of these experiences is a sense of oneness, a sense of connectedness or unity. And so now suddenly, they're not these individual distinct things, but they all kind of blend together. So we understand them differently, and we understand how we interact with them differently, and we understand how we interact with the world differently. We feel that we're part of the world instead of we're just me, trying to manage the world. And that really can create, very, very different kinds of perspectives on how to lead one's life. And I think that's in large part how we start to see these kinds of experiences affect people. And it even goes back a little bit to your very first question, that, if through bringing thousands of people into meditation, are they able to affect that kind of response even in, other people? If so, then, you're creating at least some transformational piece that can extend even beyond your own being. And if that's the case, then the world certainly can use more compassion and love these days. So maybe we'll find some ways of doing that.
Super interesting. There's just something that comes to mind here. There's a philosopher called Bernardo Kastrup. He's got a school of philosophy called Analytical Idealism, and one of the things he talks about is like, it's just an interesting thing to think about, that often experiences that lead to a reduction in brain activity can enhance the quality of conscious experience. Things like psychedelics sometimes can reduce brain activity in certain areas, near-death experiences, etc., etc. So it's just an interesting thing to think about, that a reduction in brain activity can actually lead to an expansion of awareness.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, as you said, I mean, that is part of our models of what's going on. We would expect to see decreases of activity in the frontal lobes, decreases of activity in the parietal lobes in the back of the brain, which are partly responsible for our sense of self. And so, when that area begins to decrease, we kind of lose that sense of self, that the boundary between ourself and the world. So yeah, I mean, I think that there probably are some fairly substantial decreases that occur, and that may have a lot to do even ultimately with what goes on in what's called the default mode network, which is the network of structures that are on when we're not doing anything. And there's been some interesting studies on practices like mindfulness and yoga, which have shown that they alter the default mode network. And so, and plus we have data that show not only that, but changes in some of the neurotransmitter systems, including some of the ones that are associated with psychedelics that are part of these experiences. So yeah, I mean, I think that there is definitely the ability for us to think about what are these shifts going on in the brain and how they relate to the ultimate outcomes. Because we wrote a book called How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain. And enlightenment is kind of an interesting term because it can refer to the moment of enlightenment. In which case, these experiences that we're just talking about. But then there is the, experiencing enlightenment, perpetually, that they are in a state of enlightenment, as well as an experience of enlightenment. And so the state of enlightenment is that new transformed perspective on the world. And so, very, very interesting in terms of how we start to think about the momentary effects versus the long-term effects. And that has a lot to do with how we understand what these experiences are ultimately about and how they change people.
Now I want to start talking a bit about religion, Dr. Newberg. And what's so interesting about it is, on the one hand, a religion can lead to someone like a Mother Teresa, like an incredible, compassionate person that wants to just to serve others, and someone like that. And then on the other hand, it can lead to a suicide bomber that wants to, it can lead to terrorism. So what are the major differences, based on what you've studied, between the Mother Teresa and the suicide bomber?
Well, the short answer is we don't fully know. We don't fully know why one person finds that a compassionate perspective to be more acceptable than a destructive perspective. We know that the areas of our brain, particularly a very small area called the hypothalamus, the pleasure areas of the brain are right next to the fear areas of the brain. And so, shifting a few cells one way, to the left or to the right, could have a very big impact on whether how somebody reacts and responds to threats and various things in the environment, in terms of taking a more aggressive negative reaction to them versus a more positive constructive reaction to them. So some of that may be embedded within each one of us, maybe even from birth, and it may have to do not only with where some of these cells are, but also how different receptors work in our brain, whether or not dopamine areas and serotonin, people who are more sensitive to them, less sensitive. There's certainly some evidence that these different types of neurotransmitters can have an effect on just kind of our overall how we are as people. So that's one part of the answer. Another part of the answer, which actually stems from a lot of my earlier research, has to do, it goes back a little bit to the point I was making a few moments ago about that sense of oneness or connectedness. On one hand, that sounds like a great thing. And it's great to feel that we're connected to humanity, to the universe, to God, whatever it is. That's generally a very good feeling. But there's an interesting problem that comes up, and I've talked about this in a lot of my previous works, that when you have this sense of oneness, there's a continuum. And so you have kind of our everyday world where everything has its own individual things. There's me, there's the computer, there's you. Each of these are separate, multiple objects that are distinct. Ultimately, as you kind of progress, so to speak, down a continuum of unitary experiences, you can have, a variety of interim stages, so to speak. So there could be romantic love, being, deeply connected to another person, and you feel at one with that other person, or maybe at one with your family, that you're all part of the same thing. But then as you go, further, you can ultimately get to more profound spiritual experiences, feeling connected to a community, feeling connected to the world, and so forth. And so what's interesting about that is that when you feel connected to something, that becomes your reality. And so your family, can be your reality. And what these kinds of practices and especially rituals do is they make us feel connected to that. They break our parietal lobe down, they reduce the parietal lobe activity, they break down that self-other distinction, and we feel connected to something. But the question is, what do we feel connected to? And so if it's just our family, then anything outside of that family is, it becomes a kind of us versus them. And of course, that us versus them can keep changing depending on, whether it's the family, the community. One of my favorite examples is to think about it from the perspective of like sports, take football, whether you take American U.S. football or world football. Each town has their team, and so in fact, you might start with the schools. Maybe you have two high schools or something like that. And so my high school, we hate the other high school team, but we're all part of the same town. So when we have our town's team or our city's team, all of us are for the city's team, but we hate the other city, the city, next to us. However, when you go to, the World Cup or something like that, now, all of our cities, we're all together. Now we're fighting the other countries, and someday if we find alien species and, maybe it's the whole earth, versus the other, teams from around the galaxy, so to speak. So part of what becomes interesting is, there's a lot of antagonism between you and the other, but it depends on what that other is. And so ultimately for somebody like a Mother Teresa, where, arguably speaking, she has no other when it comes to humanity. She views all human beings as needing help, as, being in the same boat, and she's part of that boat, and she's going to do what she can because she's part of everyone else and everyone is part of her. However, if you do get a group that is more isolated, and what's really important is that it actually has to do more with the ideological perspective rather than you could be a group of 10 people who all feel connected to the universe. Or you could be a group of 10 people who are connected to the group and everyone out there is, against your group. And so if you have the ideology of it's my group versus the world, then you wind up having some very substantial antagonism between people who are out there who have different ways of thinking about the world, different ways of looking at the world, and different ways of looking at your group. If they don't include you as part of their group, then you get intergroup aggression, even though the intra-group within the group is reduced by these kinds of practices and beliefs and the rituals that are part of them. So I think that goes a long way of trying to help us understand that when groups become isolated and when they begin to develop that us versus them mentality with regard to other people, then you see much more hatred, anger, outward violence. Whereas if you have a group of people who say, we're part of the human family, we're part of all of humanity, then in those practices and rituals that breed compassion and breed connection and so forth, those are going to be the ways in which we look at things. And of course, in today's world with all the divisiveness, I mean, this is exactly what we see happening. And in fact, in many ways, this is unfortunately how social media sort of works, because you're sitting there on your phone, constantly kind of being fed the stuff that supports your us versus them mentality. And if we can start to change that into, the larger groups and the larger connections and so forth, then we hopefully have, a path out of this kind of divisiveness. That's being idealistic, but that would, to me, would be the ways in which we ultimately need to get people to think. Whether we can do that or not, then that's part of what I think neurotheology has a challenge to do, which is what are the ways in which we can try to do that.
This is a fascinating subject. And am I right in saying that you co-authored your most recent book with David Yaden? Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
He has written a paper on the overview effect, the experience that astronauts have whenever they leave Earth. They see the planet as one system. They have a whole change in identity, and then they come back, and it influences their behavior. And they come back to get involved in a lot of environmental activities and everything else as well. And a friend of mine, Anahita Nizami, she's developed a virtual reality version of this that aims to sort of give people a similar experience. And it's sort of similar to what you're talking about. It's a potential way to sort of shift the identity into one that sees that we're all in the same boat here, as opposed to us and them, you know. So it's an interesting thing to think about.
That's right. And you know, I mean that, and again, there's probably different ways of doing this. I mean, they can be through psychedelics, they can be through meditation, it can be taking people into space and being able to show them that, you know, in that regard. And so there are a lot of different ways in which we might ultimately be able to achieve that. But I want to bring up one other point, which I think is just worth mentioning here, is that the other piece to all of this, and I kind of alluded to this for a second, is the ideological perspective that a person takes. And you know, talking you maybe think about this when you're talking about being in the same boat, because on one hand, all of our brains are in the same boat. And what I mean by that is that we are, you know, barring the earlier conversation we had about whether our consciousness goes beyond our brain, but for the most part, you know, we have access to the information we have access to. And not to sound circular there, but it is an incredibly small percentage of everything that's going on in the universe. I mean, we have access to like 0.00, throw in, you know, another 1,000 zeros, 1% of everything that's going on in the universe. You and I at the moment know what's happening, you know, in our little rooms. And I don't know, you know, what my wife is doing in the room next door. I don't know what's going in the apartment next door, the house next door, the town next door, the galaxy next door, you know. So so all I have access to is what's happening around me right now. And all of our brains wind up taking the whatever information we can somehow grab onto and try to create for us a perception of the world, and create for us our perspective on reality. And it might be a religious one, it might be a non-religious one, it might be one political perspective or another, whatever it is. But we have this way of looking at the world. Now, we ultimately create a kind of belief system that works for us. We wrote a book called Why We Believe What We Believe, and we create this belief system that works for, you know, each one of us does it so that it works for us. It is based a lot on the things that we have come in contact with. So our parents to start with, our friends, colleagues, you know, whatever. But ultimately, we kind of have our belief system that we hold, and then that may become the belief system of just us. It may become the belief system of our group. And so what's interesting about that, though, is that now, you know, take it that there's an external group compared to my group, and they have a different belief system than I do. So I have one of two options. Either, you know, either I'm right and they're wrong, or they're right and I'm wrong. Now, you know, which one is my brain going to choose? Well, most, you know, if I'm wrong and they're right, then my brain is in a very bad place, because that means I don't understand the world very well. And that's going to make me very anxious and upset. And it's going to, you know, it's very disturbing if I don't think I understand the world properly. So it's far easier for me to say, and far more calming for me to say, no, 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 I do understand this. They're clearly wrong. You know, I'm right. And that's also part of why, again, you know, going to social media or whatever, if I, you know, am one political party and I see an article that supports my political party, oh yeah, that makes sense to me, because that my beliefs are you know, are pacified, and I feel good about that. And if it supports that my political party is not so good, or the other party is better, oh well, no, 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 that can't be true. You know, that can't be true. It's false. You know, I need to fact check it. You know, whatever it is. And so, but as this progresses, you know, when it initially happens, if you and I had different beliefs, and, you know, maybe my first thought is, oh, well, you know, you just don't understand, you know, let me explain it to you. So it might start off very calmly, but over time, you know, if you still hold your belief and I still hold mine, which is, again, what we're most likely going to do, you know, well, you know, why would he be telling me something that I know is wrong, I know is false? You know, there must be something wrong with him. There must be, you know, he must be a bad person, and maybe an evil person, maybe somebody who I should get rid of, because, you know, clearly they're bad, evil, and they don't know what's going on. You know, so you can kind of see where these very aggressive, you know, negative behaviors can start to arise, especially if we hold on to our beliefs very strongly and we think about them in the context of a limited group as opposed to a large, you know, the larger humanity. But anyway, I just thought that that was another interesting way of kind of looking at this issue about compassion versus aggression and things like that, which is that, you know, it's not just the groups that we have, but it is the ideologies and how our brain kind of thinks through what information we want to keep and what information we want to reject. And we see it in everything. You know, I mean, it's religion, it's politics, it's science. You know, I mean, I always love it when people say that scientists are, you know, we should follow science because it's so objective. Science is done by scientists who, last time I checked, are human beings. And I've just seen in my 30-year career, so many times where scientists get so nasty and negative to people who have a new way of thinking about things, because it doesn't fit the existing paradigm, only to figure out, 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, that, oh, that is the right way to think. But at the beginning, they're kicked out and they're thrown out of the labs, and they're mocked and all, and it's, again, I mean, I think we all have to me, that's part of what neurotheology is about, which is being a little bit more open and understanding and compassionate about other points of view, which I think are very important for us to take into consideration.
Definitely. And I can just tell from the way you answer questions is that you try to integrate as many different perspectives as possible, which is so rare. Like I interview a lot of people, it's not that common, so that's interesting.
It's been part of what I think the field is all about. It's been part of my own personal experiences of sort of how I looked at things, and in a book I wrote called How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, I talk about some of my own experiences of sort of uncertainty and doubt, and being recognizing the limitations that we all have, and the genuineness with which people do develop their belief systems. And so it has made me very or at least I try to be as open and understanding of other perspectives as I possibly can.
How does God change the brain? And should atheism come with a health warning, mental and physical?
Well, from my book, How God Changes Your Brain, the answer is there's lots of ways. It is a very complex interaction, and it really shouldn't be a surprise to people. I think, when you think about religious people who are religious, when you talk about religious practices, religious experiences, sometimes they evoke thoughts, and sometimes they evoke feelings, experiences. So, sometimes you feel it in your head. You think about something. Sometimes you feel it in your body. You feel all the way down into your heart and your toes. And so, there are many different parts of our brain that ultimately help us to think about what's going on in terms of how our religious and spiritual beliefs do affect us. But I would say that there isn't just, I think maybe the big answer to your question is that there's not just one part of the brain that gets involved, but there are it basically, there's so many different parts that it's really your whole brain. The whole brain is interconnected with each other. And as an integrative medicine doctor, I recognize the brain's connection to the body. So if there's a spiritual part of ourselves, it is all of us. And in that regard, religious and spiritual beliefs and attitudes and practices really do affect us very, very deeply and very fully. Now, as far as religious versus non-religious, well, there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that being religious can be beneficial for people. Many studies have demonstrated that people who hold strong religious beliefs tend to have lower rates of depression and anxiety, a greater sense of meaning and purpose in life. But these are also have to be taken a little bit with a grain of salt, because these are population-based studies. And so, there are certainly plenty of religious people who die young, and there's plenty of atheists who live to 100. There's plenty of well-adjusted atheists, and plenty of highly anxious or religious people. But if you look at the populations, there's these kind of relationships that we can see. But part of what I also talk about in a lot of our research is that, I think ultimately everyone has a kind of spiritual side. Now, what I mean by that is not necessarily a supernatural side, but that part that feels connected to something greater than the self. And that, I've seen so many people in the scientific world who feel connected to the natural world. They feel, they recognize that we're all connected as part of our environments, as part of, when we eat, we have to eat animals and plants, and they're part of the natural world, and they have to grow, and they need sunlight. And so, like, we're everything's a big interconnected relationship. And so we can feel that, and we can take a walk in the woods, or a walk by the ocean, and feel connected to that. We can do something creative and lose ourselves in music or art or literature or something like that. So there are, I think that to me is maybe the more important point, which is that if you are kind of a true materialist who feels no connection to anything else, that's probably not going to be so good for you. And maybe that should come with a health warning. But just because you don't believe in, God or a specific religious tradition, doesn't mean that you can't engage, the overview effect, as you mentioned. It doesn't mean that you can't feel connected to humanity, that you can't do charitable works, be compassionate. You certainly can do all of those things. And so there are many different ways of engaging that part of ourselves. Religious and spiritual traditions offer some, wonderful ways of doing that. But they also come with their issues and limitations. And so, some people choose to do it in their own unique way. And of course, there's a growing group of people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious. And that's part of the answer, I think, to that overall question, which is people just need to find those ways of making that connection, even though it may not necessarily be to a specific tradition.
Okay, okay. When I was preparing for this, something that popped into my mind, and again, wild speculation, but I wanted to get your thoughts on it. So obviously in psychology, one of the most well-known theories is attachment theory. And one of the things in attachment theory is that, like, for your psychological health, it's really, really important that you have a secure base, like a social relationship that you can really depend on, like a rock in hard times.
Right.
And I just thought, I wondered, have you thought much about any link between attachment theory, in the sense that someone that has a religion or a deep sense of spirituality, is that God in that context might act as a secure base, and that might be very psychologically healthy and adaptive? What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually, I have at various times worked on some research articles and ideas that are related to that idea, and specifically thinking about attachment theory. I've talked about this in the context of worship, and what we do feel connected to, in that foundation that becomes important. And as you mentioned, I mean, whether that ultimately is a person or God, I mean, that certainly can be a very important part of a person's life, and that can provide that foundation, which can be very, very strong. So yeah, I think that is a very important way of thinking about it. I recently wrote an article about identity and how we think about ourselves, and again, also that issue of sort of, we're distinct, but then we need to connect, and that ability to connect with something that provides that foundation becomes very, very important. And that can, it can take different forms, parents and friends and family, but certainly religious and spiritual, religious or spiritual connection can be a very important part of somebody's life, and they can turn to that in times of difficulty, dealing with health issues, physical or mental health issues, dealing with life issues. So yes, having those kinds of foundations can be very, very important. And it brings up in many ways another point. Again, as an integrative medicine doctor, we frequently talk about how we care for people, and that we have to think of ourselves along 4 different dimensions of the person. We have the biological side, which is what kind of the traditional medical establishment takes care of and gives you an antibiotic or a cholesterol medicine or something like that. There's the psychological side, dealing with stress, depression, anxiety, and things like that. There's the social side, and that's where things like attachment theory and the ability to have that strong social foundation, which, there's no question that is a very, very important source of health and well-being for people. And then the 4th dimension, of course, is the spiritual side. So trying to take it into consideration, all of them, is very important. Religious and spiritual systems tend to affect us on all these different levels. So as we've shown in our brain scans, they affect our biology. As we talked about, they can affect our sense of meaning and purpose, our feelings of stress, anxiety, our ability of coping. They provide wonderful social interactions, and that could be a social interaction with a clergy member, with a community, with a congregation, with friends, family, who all share that common bond through a tradition. That can be very, very important for people. And of course, it does have the spiritual element as well. So I think absolutely that we need to think about all those different components of who we are, all the different dimensions of who we are in terms of taking care of ourselves. We talk about this in a book called weaver, where, the way to weave an optimal brain is to bring in all those different dimensions, all those different elements. And exactly how one does it, each person has to kind of find their own individualized path, but religious and spiritual traditions are certainly a very good path for a lot of people.
Sure. Something else I'm kind of curious to ask. We've got a couple of minutes left, but if I were to get you an unlimited budget and a huge research team, like, so you could pretty much do anything research wise, what would you work on?
Well, I've often thought of that question, and the main thought I kind of had is to think about it in kind of the human genome parallel, the parallels of the Human Genome Project, which looked at all of our genes. To me, I think it would be fascinating to look at all of the ways in which we engage religious and spiritual beliefs. So it would be great to take every tradition, every practice within every tradition, every belief, the specific beliefs of each tradition, look at them, brain scans of different, many of those different things, surveys of people to understand what they feel, what they mean, try to understand the differences, try to understand the similarities across traditions, cultures, people, ages, genders, all of that. And obviously with a very strong eye on the brain and consciousness and trying to elucidate that. And it extends even into, as we've kind of touched on today, the experiences related to near-death experiences, psychedelic experiences. So all of the different ways in which people kind of engage that religious and spiritual element of ourselves. That is probably what I would love to do, is to be able to kind of create that genome concept in the context of religious and spiritual practices, religious and spiritual phenomena, which again, to me, extends into many of the questions that we've addressed, including those about, what is the nature of consciousness and how does that interweave with, mystical experiences and spiritual experiences. And, the ultimate goal is, how do we understand reality? And that to me is also some combination of these kinds of scientific pursuits as well as philosophical and theological pursuits. And that's why I think neurotheology is so important of a field, because it really helps us to bring together these two most powerful forces in human history, the science and technology on one side, the spiritual and religious on the other side, and help us to understand who we are and help us to understand reality.
Definitely. Well, if there's any billionaires listening,
Let
please
me know.
direct your funds to Dr. Newberg.
I'm
There's
ready.
about 50 questions I didn't get to ask you. We've only scratched the surface here. So I just want to say a huge thank you for your time and all the work that you do and you're putting out into the world. It's fantastic. Where can people learn more? Where can they find you online? Your website is andrewnewberg.com. Is that right?
Correct. AndrewNewberg.com, Newberg. I'm also working on my Instagram presence, and so it's dr. Andrew Newberg. And so they can follow my philosophical musings there and trying to find reality. We have lots more writings, projects, books coming out, and so happy to come back and answer more questions later on, and we'll see where we can take it.
Thank you, Dr. Newberg.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to hear the full version, you can do so with the Weekend University Premium membership. This gets you access to our mastered library of over 5 years of psychology conferences, including over 230 talks and interviews with the world's leading psychologists, professors, and authors, unlimited CPD certification, transcripts, quizzes, premium passes for our annual conference, online courses with Richard Schwartz and Deb Dana, and more. The cost is £97 for 1 year, which breaks down at around 27p per day. The best bit is you can try it out for 30 days completely risk-free, as all orders come with a 100% money-back guarantee. If you're interested, please go to twmembers.com for more information.